Okay, I'm going to get us rolling here. Again, I do want to express gratitude for you all being in the space with me this afternoon. I'm Shamian Evans. I'm the Minister for Women and Gender Justice at the National Ministry setting of the United Church of Christ. Any pronouns work for me, and I'm very, very excited to have this conversation around gender today. There's so much that can be discussed. Gender is a really wide web. And so what I've tried to be thoughtful about is creating sort of an introductory webinar to get us thinking about the ways in which our understandings around gender are shaped. Oftentimes, there's a belief that if you're born a particular way, then everything's just going to fall in line, including gender. But folks don't often understand or know that gender is shaped in such a way that it can change across time, across space. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So first, if folks can let me know, what was the reason you decided to join this webinar today? If you could just populate the chat, what questions do you have? What are you hoping to learn? What brought you here? Okay, to learn, to be in solidarity, to be a better ally. Oh, wow. Okay, awesome course offering. That's great. Okay, UCC resources to learn more. Curiosity. Wonderful. So if some of you mentioned already, one of the reasons why a conversation like this is important is simply to deepen our knowledge. I imagine that some of you, perhaps most of you, are in positions of leadership. And when you're called to serve, it's also a call to keep learning, to keep growing, to keep ensuring that your roots are going deeper and deeper into the soil. There's never a point in time where we fully arrive. And there might be some folks from different avenues, from different angles, that simply are curious, just want to know more about why the conversation around gender, right, is so full of energy, why it's so impactful, and what are the ways in which we can just keep learning, right, to maybe for our own freedom, to make sure that we know that no mistakes have been made on us, that we have the full right to show up at the table as our authentic selves. And then in this point in time in our world, especially here in the United States, and I'm trying to be a little tactful about how I say this because I realize it's recording, it's going to live on, but I want to be clear that everyone's needed at the table right now. And so there's never been a point in time where I've seen so many people that are in hiding, that are afraid, that are looking to community, right? Especially as we see rights being eroded almost here on a daily basis, right? So the revolution, we can have the vision for it, but we have to be able to get in that circle first. And if we can't communicate, if we don't understand the ways in which gender, along with varying and other intersections, impact the way that we show up in relationship, we can't get to the revolution, right? So the huddle first is important. We need everyone at the table. And then to community is important to everyone, as I mentioned. So I think I've touched on all of these already. Community is important. We want to make sure that we extend an explicit invitation to the table. So part of what I'm going to be talking about today, start off a little bit, terms and definitions. Really think about this as sort of an intro. I'm not going to deep dive into any of these sections, but what I'm hoping that you take away from this maybe are more questions and answers, thinking about how gender impacts your life, impacts the relationships that you have, and also maybe you'll find that some of your assumptions around gender, some of your beliefs might get a little shaken up during this webinar, which is what part of the aim is is that we learn to live into the questions, right? That God is still speaking. So it'll be a little bit about terms and definitions, so you're clear about the terms I'll be using and through the course of this conversation. We'll take kind of a little bit of a dive into other parts of the world to show how gender identities are viewed differently, how social norms are different, behaviors, roles related to gender vary from our Western ideals. And then finally, we're going to talk about harmful constructs and the way in which it shapes how we respond to people, but also how people show up at the table. I think sometimes it's not talked about enough, that sometimes assumptions are made about why so-and-so behaves a certain way. But if we understand the impact of being marginalized as it relates to gender, race, class, etc., you can't help but have that inform the way that you show up in spaces. So care and understanding is important. And then we'll wrap up our time together with Q&A. Now, the way that I typically flow is that I certainly welcome questions throughout the webinar. Because I only have an hour worth of time, I'm going to do my best to have natural breaks so that I can have the support team that's here with me today let me know what questions have surfaced, especially if there are any reoccurring themes. I will do my absolute best to respond to them. So the first question I actually want to ask you all today is, what is, when I say sex, and I'm talking about the sexed body, what is sex? What am I talking about there? Sex is in the sexed body. And Jesus just asked the question, can you talk about the differences between gender and sex? And here we are. Okay, sex is in the sex body, okay. I see genitalia, okay, primary, sex characteristics, something you're assigned at birth, okay. Biology. I see Ashley put in there male, female. So sex has to do with primary and secondary sex characteristics. So we're talking about genitals, right? Penis, vagina. Some folks are born intersex, and that's actually another conversation, especially as we think about the assumptions related to sex and gender. You're born a certain way, then your gender must follow. But if you're born intersex, the older term is hermaphrodite. Sometimes I say that so that people go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's not used as much nowadays, though I would caution anyone against if someone says that that's how they identify, right? And it's come up in some spaces, especially with older LGBTQ folks who might reveal in some way, shape, or form that they were born a hermaphrodite. We wouldn't shut them down and say, oh, that's old, right? But generally speaking, intersex is the more modern term. So the point I'm making, though, is that if someone is born intersex, then what is their gender, right? I think even starting there, it starts to get complicated. And what has happened historically is that infants were sort of force-fed. So they would just cut into the infants at a very early age to make sure that they fit into our boxes. That should be concerning to folks. And the reason why they did that is because they wanted to make sure that the families knew whether or not to raise the child male as a man, right, or to raise the child as a woman. So instead of allowing the child to be, they were cut to fit. That should already say a little bit of something about how our rigid constructs are a little bit problematic. So sex, primary and secondary sex characteristics. What about, let's skip over to sexuality. What is sexuality? Someone made a note about hermaphrodite or intersex folks. Intersex folks have ambiguous genitalia. But some folks that are intersex can still reproduce. Okay, attraction. Sexuality has to do with attraction. Perfect. It has to do with desire. It's important to note some people do not have any desire. Now, let's talk about gender. I remember when I first took I took my first class on gender many, many moons ago. I'm not going to say when, because I'm going to age myself, but it was a little while ago. I took my first class. And I remember the first thing that the teacher asked was, how do you know if you are man, a woman, if you identify as genderqueer, you identify as something else, how do you know? How do you know you are who you are? So I want you to think about that for yourself. How do you know you are who you are? Is it just because of the way that you were born? Was there anything that you were told as you were growing up about what was appropriate for you to do or not do based on your gender? This is what's appropriate for girls. This is what's appropriate for boys. This is what's appropriate for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? It's something to think about, because gender does not equal sex. If you look up the definition of gender, it doesn't say see genitalia, see chromosomes. Why is that? If you're born male, then of course you're just a man, right? Gender has to do with masculinity and femininity, right? So if you're born a female, then of course you're a woman and you're going to be feminine. But the definition isn't that simple. So I pulled up a definition here from World Health Organization. And it reads that gender refers to the shared meanings, symbols, and expectations that societies create about what it means to be a man, woman, boy, girl, etc., etc., etc. It includes social norms. It includes behaviors. It includes roles and expressions that people are taught and are expected to follow. We see this in very young kids. Oh, no, boys don't do that. Girls don't do that, right? Already the policing happens at a very, very young age, and it depends on where you live. It depends on where you are around the globe. So before I get to the next slide, because I'm going to ask you all some questions, let me just lay out how I'm using the terms that are listed here. Gender is generally thought of as running along a spectrum, right? Even though it doesn't have endpoints, we are taught that it does. That on one side, male, man, masculinity. And then on the other side, because there's only two, that's what we're taught. Female, woman, feminine. Notably, it leaves out intersex folks, right? But from the beginning of time, I'd venture to say, and we'll have some little conversation around ancient Greece, not a whole lot, but just to demonstrate that for many, many moons, it's not been static, right? So we have folks who are transgender, which means that they transcend the binary constructs. It simply means that someone's identity does not align with their sex assigned at birth. It is different than their sex assigned at birth. So if you're born male, you feel like anything other than a man. So it's a whole spectrum. Maybe some days you feel like one. You might be fluid, right? You are considered under the umbrella of transgender. Right? Now, if you're non-binary or genderqueer, it's important as I go through these terms that it's a self-identifier. So you would never say, oh, you're queer. You're not to say that anybody's going around doing that, but invite folks to tell you how they identify, right? For non-binary, it's kind of an opting out, that you don't align with notions of masculinity or femininity. You kind of are opting out of the whole thing. You're not binded by the spectrum. If you're genderqueer, like me, more fluid, move along the lines. It's why, for example, I can go shopping in places I shop, and I see the sign that reads male. I see the sign that reads female, or I think it's man or woman. I shop wherever I want because I'm grown. So I'll dip a little bit over here, and people are watching, which is interesting. That kind of freedom sometimes brings about attention, that I'm supposed to stay just in one area. Well, I like a little bit of what's going on over here. I like the options over here. So I blur the lines even in my presentation. When I show up in this space, sometimes people even aren't sure where to put me. But then I can throw on some 4.5-inch heels, and I'm not kidding about it. And I can work it out, right? Now, That's interesting because sometimes people are shocked if they see me do that, because it's partially the way the mind works. We categorize. So because I show up and I'm masculine, oh, I couldn't wear it. You couldn't rock some heels now, right? Gender queer, fluid. And I venture to say a lot of people they arrive on this plane more fluid than fixed, but are policed right away, right? Because there are certain things that's inappropriate for someone's gender. Okay. Now you can tell I'm passionate about this because I'm staying on these slides a bit. So I'm gonna try to stay focused, but I'm in my lane right here. So I'm enjoying this conversation. Let's talk a little bit about social norms, behaviors, and roles in the West. So these are stereotypes, right? Some social norms, unspoken rules, expectations, assumptions, for example, that women should be caregivers, men should be providers, that there are only two categories. There's only men and women. Certain behaviors like women being told to smile more, which is so peculiar to me, and that men shouldn't cry, which I think can be a little dangerous, honestly. I think everybody needs to be able to share emotion. And then there are stereotypical roles, assistants, right? Supportive roles for women. And then men, the breadwinners, the head of the house, right? The ones who are the protectors. Not to say anything is wrong with any of these things. Some folks choose to be in particular roles. What I do encourage us to think about, though, are the expectations around these roles and how we treat folks if we see someone in a position where we don't think that they should be, right? This is the conversation around relationship. And then non-binary and trans folks sometimes are erased or pressured to fit in. There are some people who transition, right, that are transgender, even though it's an umbrella. Some people transition from one to what they perceive the other, transition from man to woman, and sometimes can reinforce the same constructs and say to folks that are queer, that are fluid, oh, you're just confused. You need to figure out where you're going to land. It's really interesting how that can happen in communities. So what are some other stereotypes? What are some other social norms, some stereotypical behaviors, roles that you're familiar with, that you can drop in the chat? Yes, a social construct like race, Robin, exactly. Yeah, Jesus has asked, does non-binary mean you don't fit in either male or female, you just swing back and forth from masculinity and femininity? So generally speaking, I would say it depends on the person who says, I'm non-binary, right? They would define it for themselves. But non-binary means that you're not stuck, right? That you're sort of opting out of this idea that because you were born a particular way, you have to follow all these notions of masculinity or femininity. Perhaps you don't ascribe to either, perhaps it blends, right? But generally speaking, it's an opting out of social expectations, right? Folks just kind of want to be free. Okay, here's some, employment and career areas, okay, some social norms. Yes, for same sex, same gender loving couples, one is masculine, one is feminine. That's a great example. That's a great example of how constructs can be reinforced. Okay, parenting and marriage, absolutely. Women are expected to look good all of the time. Okay, friendship, hobbies. Someone asked about, and I won't go too far into this. One thing to keep in mind is that towards the end of this time that we have, there's going to be a QR code. I have some listening sessions that are scheduled for the end of October, where I can hear from the community about some of the things that you want me to offer in terms of resources, in terms of education, the folks that you think I should be in partnership with. And I mention that right now, seeing some of the questions around sexuality and gender. If you all want some more information about this too. Oh, that's my dog. Now this is what happens when you're live, but I'm prepared. I am prepared for this. Arthur, Arthur, hey. Okay, give me, oh. And we roll with it. We roll with it. So I encourage you, when that slide comes up at the end, to just take a little photo or put your camera up for the QR code to log in to those or sign up for those listening sessions so that you can give some feedback. Additionally, on our website, I didn't do a really full introduction. I'm part of the Gender and Sexuality Justice team. If you're looking for more information around the intersection of gender, sex, and sexuality, I do encourage you to head to our website. You'll get a link to it towards the end of this webinar, and it'll also be sent to you. So I saw a few more things in there around some assumptions that have to do with behaviors, roles, stereotypes. Men are aggressive, the assumption that men are aggressive and loud, women are quiet and docile, right? Now, what I want to posit to you is that these are Western ideals. They're not universal, though typically the way that we are taught from the first time that we're in school, and then we can learn about who we are in comparison to the world in terms of our gender, we are taught biology 101, and that this is just the way that it is. It's the way that it's always been. But I want to introduce just a few different angles to get us thinking about how societies shape our understanding. So first, let's talk about Samoa. In Samoa, gender identity isn't restricted to two categories and never has been. There's men, there's women, there are fa'afafinis, and fa'afa'atama. Fa'afafini means in the way of woman. Fa'afatama means in the way of man, though I would be careful not to just assume then that the person is transgender, because again, we're imposing our Western vocabulary and language, right? The varying gender identities in Samoa hold very valuable places in culture, and their culture in terms of the work that they do, in terms of the responsibilities that they have. So it's not just a one-to-one, but it's interesting to think about that there's more than two genders that are recognized, and there's no stigma around it. It's just family, community. This is also the same in parts of Mexico, Chile, Tonga, Indonesia, and India, just to name a few. But it's not typically something that we know about or are taught about. In Central African Republic and the Congo Basin, there's a thriving community called Aka Pygmies. It's really, really interesting, the research that I did on this particular community, because there's so much interest, not only from the West, but from other parts of the world in this community because of the way that men are heavily, heavily involved in child rearing. So even though gender roles exist, they are highly fluid, and it really depends on what's happening in the community. So men often are the ones that take care of the children, and in the community, it's not believed that young infants should be laying by themselves for a long period of time. So you'll see them in arms, you'll see them on backs, right? For most of the day, because there's a belief in skin-to-skin contact and that kind of connection and what that does for the child's sense of well-being. So men are well known for spending a lot of time for holding, soothing, feeding, cleaning, even suckling their children, and being very, very close. Now, there's no stereotypes, there's no stigma, and you probably can see that there's a little bit of connection here between Indigenous communities. Something can be said about colonialism and what was introduced, right? So when we talk about communities that have not been impacted by colonialism, there are a lot of social norms, behaviors, and roles that are much more fluid. West Sumatra in Indonesia is one of the world's largest matrilineal society. The how about now? I did practice this, of course, when I'm live. I've not even come close, so I apologize for that. But the women are strong. This is a quote from a clip that I actually clip here at the end if you want to see the full video. It's about 15 to 20 minutes. Women are strong because in our tradition and culture, they hold a strategic position. They are the leaders, the moral guardians, they're the pillars, and the foundation. The women here have authority. So everything is passed down through the women. So the women make most of the decisions about what happens with the household. When someone passes on, everything is passed to the woman. So they hold a very, very prominent position. Now, one of the things that I encourage you to think about if you decide to do a deeper dive into global perspectives on gender is to be very, very careful about the sources that you go to, because you'll find sometimes people come from the West, right? And they come with their own ideals. So I saw an interview actually where they're like, don't the men have a problem with this? Don't the men just feel like they're not truly men if they're not leading, right? Because they're bringing in the Western ideals, and the men are like, some of them, now they found, and if you search, there's always going to be somebody that says, yeah, I don't know about this, right? But for the most part, the men were saying this is the way it should be. Why? Because in their society, this is the way gender is shaped, right? That it's understood. Of course, women have a lot of power. Of course, women are in leadership. This is the way that it's been. Any questions about that? Because I've been talking for a little bit. Any questions about, I see someone put in the chat, Native Americans Two-Spirit? Absolutely. Yes, the presentation will be on YouTube. Okay. I see there's a question in the Q&A that says, are autistic people more likely to be transgender, non-binary, queer, etc., and vice versa? I don't know that there's any correlation, Nicole, between autism and gender identity that I know of. Okay. All right, let us continue. So let's talk a little bit about history. Not a whole lot. What I want to do is actually flesh this out a little bit in another webinar. But I do want just for folks to think about this idea that when Jesus walked the earth, ancient Greece, sex was much more about power than it was about what was appropriate, whether you were gay, straight. Now, I know this is about gender, but I just want to drop this in here just for a second. It had to do with power. So there was the people that received and the people that were doing the giving, right? It often had to do with citizenship. It had to do with class. It had to do with status, right? Had nothing to do, though, with someone's sexual identity. Gender, too, was thought about in a little bit of a different way. There was the idea that men, and maybe this isn't so different now that I mention it, that men are closer to the sun, right? That they're closer to God. And then it actually was believed at a certain period that if little girls, if they weren't kept inside, if they weren't kept cool, right? Of course, they could play it and do what, kids did in ancient Greece for fun. But the concern was that they would heat up and their penis would fall. And now I'm telling you the truth here. You can look it up. Their penis would fall out and they would become boys. So there's something called a two-sexed model, where it was thought that everything was based on, one-sexed model. Everything was based on man. The two-sexed model wasn't introduced until later, right? Where we have man, everything was based on man. Girls could become boys if they weren't reared properly. So the reason why I mention this now is to further disrupt this idea of our thoughts around gender, our thoughts around sex, and even here I've touched a bit on sexuality. They've never been static. They've always been fluid. Society's police what is appropriate. Now, again, if any of you are interested in knowing a little bit more about how gender, sex, and sexuality was viewed in ancient times, I do hope to develop a webinar about it. But again, hopefully you can join me at the end of October and let me know if it's something that would be of interest. So what am I saying? Perspective is important, right? I've been saying this the whole time. Our beliefs aren't universal and they're not shared by everyone. We are taught to make meaning and to categorize. So if I were to walk into the space that you're in now, and I was wearing big red floppy shoes, I was wearing a polka dot outfit, I was wearing a big button nose, and I had, let's say, a purple and red wig on, what would you say that I was? Even if I hadn't spoken a word, what would you say? Okay, a clown, right? A clown. Now, how do you know that? Judith Butler has coined, and I'm not expecting anyone to remember this, but a term called citationality. Citationality is the idea that we cite back when we see something, we cite back to everything we know. There's actually a lot of conversation around race and racism that is relevant here too, right? But everything that we know, that we've come to understand about what we see, we're citing back to our experiences, we're citing back to what we've been told. So as it relates to gender, it's often why sometimes I can show up into a room and someone says, "Sir, can I help you?" Right? Because they're citing back what they know about what it means to be masculine, what it means I must be a man, right? And it's really fascinating because certain cultures, it doesn't change. Even when I start talking and we've been in community, still, it's very, very difficult to think that I could be anything other than sir, right? So this is part of the reason why some people say gender is a doing. It is the way that we show up. It's the way that we dress. It's the way that we interact in the world, right? Now, it's more complex than that. But again, thinking about this idea that our understandings around gender are shaped. Citationality, Sally asked, how do you spell citationality? But then they actually wrote citationality perfect. So you got it, Sally. You've got it. So here again, our experiences and the societies we live in shape how we understand gender. And our biases can also be shaped. So biases around sizeism, fat phobia, the idea that in the West, fat men, usually it's no issue, right? Sometimes thought of maybe you're more of a protector, right? More of a person to love, more man to love, right? But fat women, though, you have a cute face, right? Sometimes are thought of slovenly. Sometimes the assumptions are they're not as clean, right? Harmful stereotypes. Sexism, there's a lot that can be said about sexism. For example, that somehow men are more logical. Gender is shaped by power, often. Gender is shaped by power in terms of the expected social norms, stereotypes, and roles. Power does a lot to shape our understanding. Racism and sexism, the angry Black woman, right? That you can't be a Black woman and be mad about anything, or if you have to be measured, right? This is really something that is important to keep in mind, especially when in this next slide, I segue into talking about how stereotypes impact too how people show up in the world. If you are faced with constant stereotypes, you can't help but to have that influence the way that you show up in any given moment, right? That this idea that Asian women are submissive, the Latin women are fiery, right? So you can't be animated about something, right? Because sometimes the assumptions will be, oh, that's just because you're, right? That's just because you're. Stereotypes. Colorism. Light-skinned women are more desirable. Sometimes you can go into spaces and you can see that there's more light-skinned women that have been hired for certain roles than dark-skinned women. Ageism. This idea that men age like fine wine, women are past their prime. And then transphobia, right? That some folks are confused. Something must have went wrong somewhere along the way. But I've worked with families when I worked in the school district who had incoming trans kindergartners, right? They had incoming trans kindergartners. And another conversation could be had about around the age children kind of know the difference. My body, your body. My body, your body. I'm more like you than I am like you. Right? But I won't touch on that too much right now. But transphobia obviously exists in our society. What other biases can you think of that surrounding gender other than what I put here? Okay, ableism and gender. Yeah. What else? What other intersections? Classism. Absolutely. Strength. Mm-hmm. And strength in a number of different ways, not just physical strength too, right? The strength to do certain things, to get the job done. Leadership roles, especially in the church. That's right. There's a reason why. Okay. So let me back up. So the impact here, right, of gender and the varying intersections. It does impact how we treat people. Don't be fooled. It doesn't matter what position you're in. It doesn't matter the work that you do. People have unconscious biases, and they show up when a person shows up in the room, right? It's the reason why I think about my work and my life. When someone says to me, "Oh, you're so well spoken," after I've said something, there's a little something to be said there, right? It's not said in a malicious way, but I don't know if they're saying the same thing to their peers, right? When they come off the stage, are they saying to Tom, "Oh my gosh, you are so articulate"? Probably not. I've never heard it before, but I get it, right? Because there's something about exceptionalism, maybe, right? There's something underneath there. So biases don't necessarily, they don't have to be malicious, right? But if we're not aware of the way in which we think about people as it relates to gender, race, class, all these varying intersections, in some way, shape, or form, it shows up. It shows up on who we decide should lead, who should be in the back, right? It decides who takes up more space in a room, right? Because they feel like it's appropriate, right? A lot of conversation will be had around gender, and then whose voice should be heard, right? And then whose voice sometimes are silenced or spoken over. So biases around gender, they absolutely do show up. And I do encourage folks to really think about that, to think about when you see somebody, let's say you see a woman who has a little bit more to work with, right? And you tell her, "Wow, what a pretty face you have." Thinking about how the impact of that, right? And how it relates to stereotypes, assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't say this to get people to go, "Oh my God, I need to think about everything I say." Yes and no, just to be aware. Because these are conversations we don't really have a lot. There are a lot of things that people say and do that people don't ever check because it becomes normalized, right? It becomes normalized. The other side of this is when we think about the communities that we serve, or we even think about ourselves, if we're not in the center of privilege, it's important to understand that living in a world where there's gendered stereotypes, like some of the ones that we've talked about, whether it relates to your gender identity, the fact that you're a woman, right? A woman of color, right? Black, certain socioeconomic status, et cetera, it does heavily shape and inform how you show up. It's one of the reasons why throughout my life, I've kind of always been asked to hang up one of my hats, right? I come into a space that's mostly queer, let's say, mostly white, right? There's some way in which it's like, "Oh, you can hang up that race jacket over there because, we're queer and we all get along." And it's like, well, unless you know the experience of what it is to be Black in this world, I can't separate the two. I am Black, right? On the other side, my community, my folks, right, come into circle with them. Sometimes I'm asked, well, why do we need to talk? We're Black first. Why do we need to talk about this queer stuff and these pronouns and what? Because the way that I am in the world, just like how my Blackness shapes and informs how people treat me, so does my queerness, right? You may never know what it's like to go to the bathroom and worry. Now you're just trying to go pee, but worry whether or not someone's going to call, right? The security on you. Worry if someone's going to come around you and go, oh, you're in the wrong bathroom. So you might be going to the restroom thinking about where you're going to cook for lunch, for dinner. All right, what am I going to watch tonight? Some of us, because of our gender identity or expression, we're super present because we don't know. We're looking around to make sure that we're safe. That's why it matters, right? These intersections matter. They can't be parsed out because they shape and impact how we show up in the world, what we experience, right? So when you think about the communities that you serve, you have some people walking in the door, right? Doesn't matter if you're a church leader, right? You don't know how the very intersections of gender, right, have shaped the way that they show up in your space. If you work in a nonprofit or someone else, you don't know how just having two sections on that intake form, right, male, female, you don't know if a young person is going, well, there's not a space for me here. It matters. It matters, that kind of extravagant welcome, right? Expanding the table, it matters, okay? So here are some takeaways. I'm doing good on time too. Sex, gender, and sexuality. They are distinct categories, though they're often conflated. Sex, primary and secondary sex characteristics. Sexuality, desire. Some people don't have desire at all. Asexual. And gender, of course, is how you feel, but also it's shaped in some ways by the societies that we live. So I'm saying two different things. Gender identity is how you feel, right? You feel like a man, whatever that means to you. Feel like a woman. Feel like you're queer. You feel like you're demigender. And I know I'm going to we'll have a terms sheet. We'll have some more conversation. It's how you feel, but also I hope that during this conversation, you can also see the ways that gender is shaped, right? In terms of expectations. Sex does not equal gender. What we consider normal, gender identities and behaviors, may not be the same in other parts of the world, perhaps was different over time. Societies we live in shape our understanding about gender, and this can include harmful gendered stereotypes, some of which can be subconscious or unconscious. So I want you to think for a moment, and I'm going to invite some questions in because I saw that the chat is moving, but I haven't been able to keep up with everything that's there. But I do want you to think about, maybe I'll go here first. Yeah, I'm going to go here first, actually. Maya Angelou said that while I know myself as a creation of God, I am also obligated to realize and remember that everyone else and everything else are also God's creation. Does that mean that we have all the answers? No. Does that mean it's not going to be messy? No. But it does mean that we should be clear about extending the invitation. Be clear about wanting to grow. You don't have to have all the answers. To add a few more seats to the table, to say welcome, because it matters, especially now. I want you to hear me when I say that this conversation, it matters. Not everybody has the support that they need. I'm talking about our young people too. You might be the only safe space. It might be your organization. It might be your church. It might be your community where someone's walking in the door and they're looking for the extravagant welcome. Am I accepted here for who I am? And here I'm not just talking about expansive gender identities. I'm not just talking about trans folks. I'm not just talking about queer folks. I'm talking about women, right? I'm talking about older women. I'm talking about folks that are undocumented, right? Women. I'm talking about folks all along the spectrum. Am I welcome in your spot? And it's important when you say welcome, it's not a melting pot. We'll just come on in and it's like everybody's just the same. We're not the same. Especially if we're not in the seat of privilege, the further we are out on the margins, our world is very different, right? So the extravagant welcome means not only that you make space, but you also are clear about what your space looks like to make sure that the welcome is felt so that it doesn't end up being a melting pot. So I guess what I'm saying is that I hope that we can just learn to live into the questions, right? That we can learn to hear that God is still speaking, that maybe there's more that we can do to make sure that our spaces actually are free or minimal stereotypes, right? That we have women in leadership, right? We don't have women burning out because the expectation is that you've got to rise above, right? There's so much that can be spoken about here, but I hope that you all hear my heart. I really do. I hope that you hear my heart today. So we have 10 minutes here. I am going to read through this, but I realize because there's 10 minutes, I want to leave time for you to pull up the resources, and that'll be just in a moment. And then I also want to leave time if there's any questions. So what I want you to be thinking about, what I invite you rather to think about, is if there's anything that's holding energy for you, and it could be bad too. Energy is energy. Bad energy, if you're feeling a little bit like, oh, sometimes that's good too, right? To go with it. What does today's conversation bring up for you in your own setting and your own context? How might you create more space for people to show up fully without assumption, if it's possible? What small shift could you make in your preaching, your programs, your forms, your policies to ensure that folks really truly feel welcomed, especially now we need everybody at the table? And what might be the divine be revealing to you? Is God yet still speaking? And if so, in what ways? So this will be on YouTube after. I don't expect anybody to write these things down. It'll be on YouTube if you want to come back. And even if you don't want to come back, if you can sit with whatever energy, whatever is holding energy for you from this webinar, I'd say that's the place to be. So before we get to resources and questions, I do want to invite you, those of you that have a phone, a QR code can be scanned here. Also, it'll be dropped in the chat, a link to sign up for upcoming Zoom listening sessions that I've termed them. So what are they? They're literally sessions, and I said this at the top, but I'll repeat it here, for the community to share about the things that would be helpful for them as it relates to the role of women and gender justice. One of the things that I want to be clear about is that, of course, I'm coming in with my own thoughts around reproductive justice, around race, right, around a number of different things. But it's important to hear from community, to know, especially in this political climate, what kind of resources are folks looking for, right? What kind of webinars, what kinds of conversations, what would be helpful? So if that's something that sounds of interest to you and you have time, please do join in conversation. They'll be taking place on October 22nd and again on October 29th. The form gives you access to both, but you only need come to one unless, of course, you want to come to both. You'll be in conversation with different people from varying parts of the states and maybe even the world, who knows. So those listening sessions are coming up and they'll be about an hour to hour and 15 minutes. Resources. So there's a lot that I've talked about this past hour. This QR code will lead you to our website, Gender and Sexuality Justice Ministries. If you scroll down, you'll see three. You'll see the Gender and Sexuality Justice, which is led by our ward. You'll see sexuality. That's our whole lives curriculum. It's inclusive sex ed curriculum that's led by Amy Johnson. And at the end there, you'll see women and gender justice, which is a work in progress. I just arrived at National Ministry Setting, so I haven't been able to put my flavor on it yet, so it's under construction. But the resources that I mentioned here right now will be housed there, and a link has just been dropped in the chat. I put together one Google Doc So it has videos, it has books that I reference, and it has the books that I'm recommending here. The first is Doing Gender Diversity. They're kind of short essays. Even though it has theory in the title, it's very, very accessible. There's some conversation about fa'afifinis that I mentioned, some conversation about a community called Guevadoce in Brazil, I believe, that has to do, again, with communities that recognize more than 2 genders across the world, but also some conversation around class and gender, race and gender, safety and gender, right? It's a really, really thorough, I think, kind of dive into the varying aspects of gender. I really would encourage you all, if you're interested, to pick up that book. And then this one called Queer, A Graphic History. I'm a visual learner, so I love graphic novels. This one talks a little bit more about the introduction of queer. Queer was initially coined as a derogatory term, but has been reclaimed. Of course, there's still tension around there, but it really talks about the trajectory of gender and power over time. And then we have fun. Okay, so here's additional resources. This is all going to be sent. And then here I'm just like giving credit to the photos that I pulled up. Okay, so there's 5 minutes that's left. I've been talking quite a bit. I hope some of this has been helpful. Are there any questions? The books you can get from a wide variety of places. The ones on my shelf, queer graphic novel, I got from Amazon, but there are many, many places that you can pick up the book. Oh, I don't know the question to that. I don't know the answer to that, rather. Is there required training from ONA affiliated congregations? I'll need to get back to you. I'll need to figure out how we can get back to folks if I don't know the answer to some of these questions. Yeah, Andrea, you can remove the slides. We have a few minutes here. Really, if there are any questions, someone asked about where to get the books. You can get them a variety of places, Amazon, some other places. Any other questions? I like how someone put no in the chat. There are no other questions. Okay, that sounds good to me. I hope this has been edifying to the soul. I hope that you've gotten something, anything, portions are helpful. Do you do trainings at other congregations? Yes, I do trainings, period. So great question. If you're interested in connecting with me, now I just arrived, just put my code up, so you might have to give me a second. But if you're interested in having me out to lead some sort of gender inclusive workshop, again, it can be Gender 101. We're talking about transgender identities, there's a lot, there's really a lot. It depends on the need of the community. Feel free to reach out to me. I think my email is up on the website, but if not, it is Evans, EVANSS @ucc.org. All right, you all, I don't see any other questions. Thank you all thank you. Oh, my wife is on. Thank you, Boo, for being here. Thank you all. When is intersex again? Intersex has to do with ambiguous genitalia. Maybe not a fully formed penis, sometimes there is. Maybe not a fully formed vagina, though sometimes there is too. But it means that there's ambiguous. Maybe there's one, a portion of one or the other or both. And sometimes chromosomes are a little bit different as well. Thank you, Leah. Appreciate your support, family. Appreciate it. All right. Well, seeing no other questions, I hope that you all have a good evening. I pray that that there's some fruit stems from this in your communities. All right. Goodbye, all.